Today we're going to talk about how to get warm in your van. Step 1, become famous on YouTube. Step 2, download Tinder.
Yeah, that's not funny.
Okay, so first things first, insulation. What insulation are you going to use in your van? Are you going to insulate your van? And then how thorough will you actually be when you're installing that insulation in all the crevices and cracks and odd shapes of this van? I went with Thinsulate, 3M Thinsulate insulation, which I have been incredibly satisfied with. There are a lot of different discussions on insulation and vapor barrier and condensation and moisture and all this different stuff. And that's why I went with Thinsulate. One, because I tend to side with the argument of there's no way you're sealing this van. There's always going to be a way for moisture to come in and escape, and there's always going to be a way for moisture to generate and to build. So there's no way you're going to seal it perfectly. So 3M Thinsulate is amazing because it's hydrophobic. No matter how much condensation might build on the inside of the walls, it's not going to absorb that moisture and then mold or rot or whatever. It can't. It repels that water, which is amazing. Early on in the build, I had a couple leaks in the roof, and I thought I had ruined all of my insulation, and then I realized it was hydrophobic and the water hadn't ruined any of my insulation. So that was amazing. I also was really thorough with the installation of the insulation. That's quite a sentence. I was getting in every single crack. I was trying to cover every single seam, making sure that everything was touching. I stuffed things in the pillars. I went all out to try to cover this thing in insulation because I knew I'd be spending a lot of time in cold weather, and I knew that you do it once and then you can't go back except for tearing the walls apart to redo it. So you might as well do it right the first time. There's also Easy Cool, which is a radiant barrier installed on a lot of different areas of the van, but that's more for heat reflection and keeping the van cool. But still, I advise you do that as well if you plan on being in both temperatures. For the floor, I believe the more top or popular option is this thing called Mincel. I believe that's what it's called, which is a lot more expensive than what I went with, which is Foamular rigid insulation foam board. That being said, I did save some money on the floor, but I think my floor could have been a lot warmer had I gone with Mincel. So the Foamular is great, it's cheap, it's easy to work with, and it's really satisfying to get done and put in there, but my floor is freezing most mornings just because that insulation is not very strong at all. If I went with the Mincel, I think my floor would be a lot more resistant to the cold on the outside of the van, and perhaps my toes would have a little bit better time in the morning. In addition to the walls and the floor, as well as the ceiling, I then created window inserts for the primary windows that I have. I have this desk window over here, the 2 rear windows, and then the window in the kitchen, as well as the area dividing the cab from the back of the van. And all that is thermal blackout curtains, like what you would see in an apartment hanging from a curtain rod, cut up and sewn into like pillowcases, which is then stuffed with a single sheet of extra Thinsulate that I had from using in the van. So I just took that extra Thinsulate, sewed together those bags of blackout curtains, and then put the Thinsulate inside, sewed them up, and then the desk window and the kitchen window are just sitting in there, and sometimes they fall out while I'm driving, but while I'm sitting still they stay in there, and the ones in the rear have magnets on the edges which then attach around the frame of the window, which is metal. The one between the cab and this living area of the van, it's just a simple curtain on a curtain rod with the Thinsulate inside, and I stretch it across, and it actually works really well. In the mornings when I pop up into the front to grab something that I forgot or to start the car or something, it is freezing on one side of the curtain, the front of the car, and then relatively warm back here, so it actually does a really good job. Additionally, when you're in the warm temperatures and you want to keep heat out of the van, these blackout curtains actually do really well. So these back windows are huge portals for heat to come into the van, for sunlight and heat to come into the van. But when I throw those up in extra bright and hot areas like Texas and California and Arizona, one side of them, the outside facing one, will be burning hot from the sunlight and the inside will still be cool to the touch. So those blackout curtains have a really great purpose for reflecting heat as well. Finally, it's not just about keeping heat in, it's about generating heat. A lot of people go with little buddy heaters, I believe they're called, which are like a propane hookup to a little mobile thing that burns and then creates heat. That's great, it's mobile, it's cheap, you can move it around. For me, I wanted a more permanent option as well as something that vented outside the van, so there was less chance of carbon monoxide buildup in the van and then my death, which is a great thing to consider in your van build, staving off your inevitable death.
Depression, isn't that just a fancy word for feeling bummed out?
Dwight, you ignorant slut!
So I went with an S-bar gasoline heater, which is actually permanently installed underneath the passenger seat and hooked up to the actual gas tank of the car, which is absolutely amazing because I never have to worry about refilling the heater because I just make sure my car is above a quarter of a tank and it can run forever. Originally, when I installed this, I was very apprehensive I'd be using a crap ton of gasoline just to heat the van, and I felt like I'd feel guilty for staying warm in the van at the cost of a lot of money in gasoline. But now, after 3 months of using it almost constantly, I have barely ever even noticed the use of gasoline, and that's running it constantly. That's keeping it at about 65 degrees in here and set on infinity, meaning it just runs until I tell it not to. This is the only thing that I paid someone else to do, an actual van upfitting company, just because it was above my pay grade and above my confidence level for actually altering serious things in the car, because you have to drop down the gasoline tank in order to be able to access the auxiliary port to then hook up the heater and drill holes and all that different stuff. I just wanted somebody else to do it so that I could blame them when it breaks. And turns out it's broken a lot of different times and I blamed them every single time. Just kidding. Now, it's broken a few times and I blame myself. I've had a lot of different issues with this heater and it's definitely been a nightmare a lot of times, but it also was this huge blessing that I could not live without. So the nightmares, a lot of them have stemmed from electricity changing. So the voltage drop due to temperature change or due to the amount of battery capacity, the state of charge of my batteries. And that's my fault, not keeping an eye on my electricity or letting the batteries get too cold by not running the heater. That's part of why I run it constantly now, because I have to keep the batteries warm in order for them to operate. The second issue is a lot of times I'll run it while I'm driving, which means the gasoline in the gasoline tank is moving. And I imagine occasionally the auxiliary port doesn't have full access to gasoline. And then that causes an interruption in the intake for the heater. And then it gets confused and it shuts itself down. I've been able to persevere. I've been erasing memory log to reset the errors. I've been just pushing through the errors. I've been Googling the errors. I've been doing everything I can to try to fix it. And ultimately I have been able to troubleshoot it on my own on the road without having to pay the company that installed it $120 an hour to come and fix it again. So I would definitely recommend the heater. Just know that like everything in your van, it's not perfect and you have to figure stuff out on your own sometimes in the middle of nowhere when it's freezing cold. Finally, your blanket.
Put some clothes on, man. Jesus Christ.
So sometimes the heater isn't working perfectly and it's struggling to keep it warm in here, or sometimes the heater is broken, or sometimes whatever. It's good to have backup options. A lot of people will use a sleeping bag, a very, very low temperature rated sleeping bag, but personally, I don't really like the feel of the inside of a sleeping bag. I get kind of claustrophobic, and sleeping bags are for camping, not for living. So if I want to live in here, I'm going to use blankets, and I've been super happy with these three. This one, it is cotton, I believe, super, super soft. I love it. It's light, so in the summer, this is all I use, and I pack these ones away, and in the winter, I just throw it on for an extra layer of warmth. This one is a Pendleton, which I was not convinced I needed, and then a friend convinced me to actually look into one and get one, and then return it if I didn't want it. I love it because it's beautiful. It is incredibly warm. I can feel it trap in heat almost instantly when I curl up at night.
Can't go to sleep unless I get tucked in.
But then also, it's washable. I don't think it's recommended that you wash it a bunch because it starts to wear down the blanket, I believe, but it is washable in case something happens, or you know, you live in a van, you need to wash things. This one is kind of an off-brand Pendleton. It's not as nice. It doesn't retain heat as well. It's a lot more abrasive in my experience, and it doesn't look as pretty, but still it works and it does its job and it's washable. I do the 2 wool blankets and the cotton blanket, and I just double them up since I'm only one person in here.
I'm so lonely.
And I'm absolutely warm every single night. There are some nights when the heater isn't working and it's negative some degrees and it gets reasonably chilly. But still these keep me warm. So I consider these an essential. My 2 wool blankets and my nice cotton blanket for in the summer. A bonus option that I did not anticipate that I would use or want, slippers. Remember I was talking about the cold floor? A lot of times in the morning as I'm going about the van, getting it all cleaned up, put back together, the bed away, the dishes done, cooking breakfast, whatever it might be, I'm walking around barefoot because I haven't put socks on for the day, or even if I have put socks on, it's still pretty cold. I got a pair of these slippers and they have made a huge difference just not being directly on the floor. Now, that's probably old news for a lot of you guys that actually use slippers in real life, but I never used slippers before because they were weird and I didn't want to use slippers. So now I'm a slippers person. Maybe I'm getting old.
Well, I guess this is growing up.
So at the end of the day, it's a combination of the insulation that you install in your van, which I use the 3M Thinsulate, the window inserts, which I think are essential even if they're not perfect, what you're using in your floor, which I could have used better insulation, use the Mincel instead of the Foamular, what you're using to actually generate heat. I went with the permanent option. You can look into little buddy options, but if you're thinking of using this van for a lot of snow chasing, a lot of adventures and skiing and all that different stuff, I would get a permanent option, but I found it to be something I don't regret at all, if not just because of how efficient it is and how little I have to worry about refilling and all of that different stuff. Also, it's good not to die from carbon monoxide buildup in the van at night. That's always a plus. And then your blankets. I love my Pendleton, I love my off-brand, and I love my softer cotton one. Those 3 in combination are perfect. I'm warm every single night, a little too warm sometimes. Step 2, download Tinder. And I don't regret the decision to splurge on the Pendleton at all. So get yourself some good insulation, get yourself a good heater, get yourself some good blankets, and you can stay warm in your van no matter how cold it is outside.